Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into Chicago, looking at how it became the city we know.
Yeah, we're focusing on three really powerful forces, right?
Exactly. First, the Great Fire of 1871. Then, its huge industrial growth, steel, and everything that came with it.
And, crucially, the city's long and complicated history with racial and ethnic segregation.
Right. How these things didn't just happen side by side, but were interconnected, shaping each other. That's kind of our mission today, to untangle that a bit.
Okay, so where do we start? Way back.
Yeah, let's. Because Chicago's location was key from the get-go, long before Europeans arrived.
It was a vital crossroads for indigenous tribes. The Potawatomi part of the Council of Three Fires, for instance, super important spot.
And the name itself, Chicago, wild onions maybe, or smelly waters, it points to the land.
And that Chicago portage, that little strip of land connecting the Great Lakes watershed to the Mississippi system.
A total geographic linchpin. Even early European explorers like Joliet and Marquette spotted its strategic value immediately.
They absolutely did. Which, makes the later forced removal of the Potawatomi, who had been there for generations, feel even starker. That geography dictated so much early on.
And speaking of early figures, we have to talk about Jean-Baptiste de Sable.
Ah, yes. Chicago's first permanent non-native settler, a really fascinating person.
Totally. Of mixed African and French descent, a skilled trader, he set up shop right there at the mouth of the river around the 1780s.
And it wasn't just some small outpost. Sources describe a pretty substantial operation. A proper house, outbuildings, a mill. He was married to Kitty Hawa, a Potawatomi woman, quite prosperous.
It's interesting, though, how his recognition as, the founder took a while. It sort of hints at the complex racial dynamics from the very beginning, doesn't it?
It certainly raises questions about whose stories get centered, but his establishment, using that key portage location, definitely set the stage for trade.
Which evolved, right, from
Right.
fur trading to grain and lumber.
Yeah.
Fort Dearborn goes up.
And then 1848 hits. That year was a real turning point.
How so?
You get the Illinois and Michigan Canal completed. Finally, a navigable waterway connecting Lake Michigan to the Illinois River and thus the Mississippi.
Okay, huge for transport.
Massive. And in the same year, the first railroad line reaches Chicago, and the telegraph arrives too.
Wow. Canal, railroad, telegraph all at once. Talk about connecting the city.
Exactly. It just catapulted Chicago towards becoming the nation's rail hub. The Board of Trade was founded around then, too, formalizing its role in commodities. It was incorporated as a city back in 1837, but 1848 really lit the fuse for explosive growth.
So you have this booming city growing incredibly fast, but mostly made of wood.
That's the catch. Rapid development, lots of timber construction, buildings crammed together. It was, well, kind of a disaster waiting to happen.
Enter 1871, the Great Chicago Fire.
After an unusually dry summer, remember? And the city's fire department was already exhausted from fighting fires just days before.
The whole O'Leary cow story, probably more myth than reality.
Most historians think so. But whatever the spark, once it started, with the strong winds and all that available fuel, it just took off, even jumped the Chicago River.
The scale of destruction is hard to fathom. Thousands homeless, huge swaths of the city gone, lives lost.
Truly devastating.
Yeah.
But Chicago's response was, frankly, remarkable.
That famous resilience. Rebuilding started almost immediately.
And importantly, they changed the rules. New fire codes mandated brick, stone, iron, non-combustible materials for rebuilding the central business district.
And that necessity, it spurred innovation, right, architecturally.
Precisely. Architects had to figure out how to build tall and fireproof. This leads directly to the first Chicago school, the development of steel frame construction. Basically the birth of the skyscraper.
So, ironically, the fire cleared the way for Chicago's iconic modern skyline.
In a very real sense, yes. A painful catalyst, but a catalyst nonetheless.
Okay, so the city rebuilds, bigger, stronger, taller, and then comes the era of steel, the industrial behemoth.
Oh, yeah. The Union Stockyards are probably the most famous symbol of this. Opened in 1865, but really hit their stride after the fire. Carl Sandburg's hog butcher for the world.
They pioneered things like the disassembly line, right?
Yeah.
And refrigerated rail cars.
Absolutely revolutionary for the time. It industrialized meatpacking on a scale never seen before, changing how Americans ate. And the steel industry itself boomed. thanks to those railroads bringing in iron ore and coal.
Chicago, as the railroad capital, was essential for all this industry.
Completely intertwined. Raw materials came in, finished goods went out, a perfect storm of industry and logistics.
But this massive industrial growth had a human cost, working conditions.
Often terrible. Long hours, low pay, dangerous work. It drew huge numbers of immigrants from Europe looking for jobs, but it also fueled intense labor conflicts.
Events like the Haymarket Affair, the Pullman strike, they highlight that tension.
Definitely. Major, often violent confrontations between workers trying to organize and powerful industrial interests. Really defining moments in American labor history happen right there.
So as the city fills with factories and workers, it's also becoming more segmented, divided.
That's the parallel story. You have waves of European immigrants forming tight-knit ethnic enclaves. Think Little Italy, Pilsen, Greektown, people sticking together, often facing prejudice themselves.
And then, starting in the early 20th century, the Great Migration.
A massive movement of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South for northern cities like Chicago, seeking jobs and escaping oppression.
But they faced a different kind of segregation in the North.
A very systematic kind. Not always by law, like in the South, but through practices like restrictive covenants, agreements written into property deeds preventing sales or rentals to Black people.
And redlining, where banks would literally draw red lines on maps around Black neighborhoods and refuse mortgages or insurance there.
Exactly. Discriminatory lending practices, often supported or ignored by public policy, it effectively forced African Americans into specific areas, primarily the Black Belt on the South Side. Latino communities, arriving later, faced similar segregation and displacement, especially Mexicans and Puerto Ricans.
And the legacy of these practices, it's not just history, is it?
Not at all. You see it today in the stark disparities in wealth, income, poverty rates between different parts of the city. Unequal access to quality education, healthcare, even fresh food. Investment patterns still often reflect those old lines drawn decades ago.
How did the city's physical planning interact with this, like the World's Fair?
The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, The White City, presented this gleaming, orderly, classical vision of Chicago. It showcased the city's recovery and ambition.
Kind of papering over the divisions?
You could argue that. It was influential architecturally, sparking the City Beautiful movement, but it wasn't necessarily reflective of the whole city's reality. Then came the Burnham Plan of 1909.
Daniel Burnham's grand plan. Lakefront preservation, parks, radial highways.
A hugely ambitious blueprint. Make no little plans. It shaped much of modern Chicago's layout.
Yeah.
But again, it was conceived and implemented within that existing segregated structure, where highways were built, for instance, sometimes reinforced or even created physical barriers between communities.
Okay, let's jump ahead again. Industry starts to decline.
Yeah, de-industrialization really hits from the 1970s onward. Steel mills close, the stockyards shut down in '71, massive job losses, particularly devastating for the Black and Latino communities who were heavily reliant on those manufacturing jobs.
The city has to reinvent itself again, moving towards services, finance, tech.
Right, a shift to a more service-oriented and knowledge-based economy. Finance, professional services, healthcare, higher education, and more recently, a growing tech sector. You also see big redevelopment projects aimed at transforming former industrial areas.
Like Lincoln Yards, the 78. But those bring up debates about gentrification and who benefits, right?
Always. And alongside those big projects, there are efforts like Invest Southwest, specifically trying to funnel public and private investment into neighborhoods on the south and west sides that have suffered from decades of disinvestment. It's about trying to address those historical inequities.
So wrapping it all up, what's the state of play in contemporary Chicago, shaped by this fire, this steel, these divisions?
It remains a city of contrasts, still grappling with high living costs, inequality. Unemployment rates often reflect those historical divides. You see population shifts, growth from international migration, but some out-migration of Black residents, for example.
Ongoing challenges with violence, schools, healthcare access.
Yes, all tied into that complex history. But Chicago also has this incredible cultural vibrancy, a deep history of community organizing and activism, amazing music, food, art scene. And it's making serious commitments to climate action, trying to do it equitably.
It feels like the city is constantly wrestling with its past to shape its future.
I think that's exactly right. Understanding how the fire forged a new physical city, how industry built its economic might but also fueled conflict, and how segregation drew lines that still shape opportunity today. That's essential for understanding Chicago, and maybe, for understanding the challenges many American cities face.
A constant process of becoming, built on a really complex foundation. Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks so much for joining us.